Erev Tov, Shalom to you all. This is another webinar with a unique twist. Our usual co-sponsors are co-sponsoring this as well. In addition to Hiddush, Hiddush, Rabbis and Kentes for Religious Freedom and Equality in Israel, J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and the American Association for Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. But this time, we have the wonderful co-sponsorship and partnership with the Rackman Center, the Ruth and Emmanuel Rackman Center at Bar-Ilan University Law School, committed to the advancement of status of women in the very spirit of the late Rabbi and Mrs. Rackman and Ruth Rackman, and there is no one that represents their spirit better, as far as I know, than our speaker, Professor Ruth Halperin Kadari, the founding director of the center.
Me?
Oh, I forgot to mute. 1 second. All right.
You arrived just in time.
Okay. So, as I said, there is no one better to represent both the spirit of the wonderful legacy of the late Rabbi Manny Rackman. And I did not have the privilege of knowing his wife, but I understand she was a soulmate and a partner. And no better and more qualified person to speak on the rich topic of women and COVID-19 pandemic, law, politics, religion, and state. It's a tall order, but if there is someone who can deliver that order, it's our speaker. You read her bio, Yale Law School graduate, founding director of the Rackman Center, has taught at quite a number of universities in the world, and has served and has done tremendous pride to Israel 3 terms on the UN Commission that is dealing with the International Covenant for the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, and twice as vice chair. You can read her books on women in Israel, her book on women in Israel, and in general, we are all grateful to you, Ruth Halperin Kadari, for enriching our webinar series and speaking on the topic that is of interest to many, many people. So go ahead, the screen's yours.
Thank you very much, Uri.
Just one, sorry. So as Professor Ruth Halperin Kadari speaks, you are welcome to write your questions, comments in the chat. I will try and follow it and present the questions to Ruth. If there is reason to turn to you and unmute you and have you ask the question, we'll do that. And as I said before, the session is recorded and you'll be able to follow it and share it with others. And I hope you do after a day or two. Go ahead, sorry.
Thank you very much, Uri. I'm really grateful for this invitation, and it's moving to see people from across the Atlantic or across the sea joining in and just convening together to think, to hear, to discuss the topics which are so close to our hearts here in Israel. It's become probably a cliche by now that with all the real difficult ramifications of COVID-19 on which I'm going to speak today, there are some unexpected nice developments, such as this form of convening webinars together. We've all come so used to virtually getting together on the screen, but it really feels, I think, the purpose, and I hope to really add something to you this morning over there in North America, or this evening over here in Israel. So without further ado, I will share my PowerPoint presentation now. and I hope we will not encounter any inconveniences. I'll start. The topic is really a very, very broad one. And let me, right at the beginning already, just put, on the table what's the starting point for my discussion. And as I go along, you will see that I put quite a number of media reports on the issues that I'm going to raise. It's no news for you that the international media has been very, very alert to the gender ramifications and the disparate gender ramifications of COVID-19, different and harder hitting women than men. There's a lot to read on the websites, and I just included these along the slides of the PowerPoint presentation. I think that at the beginning, we are already half a year into this unprecedented global pandemic. But at the very beginning, there was this kind of illusion that we're all together in this, and that the virus does not discriminate between women and men, between the rich and the poor, and everybody is susceptible and everybody is in danger, and it's like a shared destiny of humanity, of humankind. But this is, of course, an illusion, because the opposite is true. Those who are weak, and those who have less, and those who start at a disadvantage are being hit much, much harder than the rest. Countries that have started at a low point are being hit much, much harder than countries that started at a high point. And the topic that is of interest to me this evening is the gendered aspects, and women are being hit much, much harder than men by this pandemic. And the next starting point of my conversation today is the fact that when looking globally, leadership in the world, women still make less than 10% of the global leadership. So we have two opposite starting points here. Women are being hit much harder, but women do not make world leadership. And the third starting point, which I will get to in a few slides, is the amazing differences in the outcomes of women's leadership where there are leaders, which only stresses this point, this question of how come there are so few women leaders in the world. And when we get to Israel, this question will become even more acute as we go along. And another starting point for our conversation is that the sad reality is that no country in the world has yet achieved full gender equality in practice, and only 8 countries, according to a very, very thorough and impressive data research by the World Bank, only 8 countries of the 193 United Nations member states has achieved full gender equality legally, formally. So again, the illusion that we've achieved equality, and some would like to say that we are already in a post-feminist era, this is another illusion which we must tear apart. It's simply not true. And this pandemic and the way that it affected women worse than men is really a very, very sad and painful reminder of the fact that striving towards gender equality and those achievements that women did achieve in the past century can be labeled the feminist century or the women's equality century. It's actually, we are now commemorating exactly the centennial of women's suffrage in the US. Last year, we commemorated centennial to the establishment of the women's movement in pre-state Palestine. So we are in an era commemorating the century of women. But now this pandemic reminds us how fragile women's achievement are in fact, and how easy it is to tear apart so much of our achievements. Now, these disparate gender impacts are really across the board. And of course, I will not have time today to go through all these points, and I really only put a few of them here. So we're starting with the health issues. Of course, the pandemic is first and foremost a health issue. And here again, at the beginning, there was the impression that death rates among men are somewhat higher than amongst women, but this by now has become much less clear, and it seems that this is not due to construction of the virus, but rather due to maybe some dangerous behaviors or dangerous customs that men tend to take, such as men smoke in higher rates than women, and so on and so forth. But what is very clear is that across the globe, women make about 70% of the healthcare workers. So they are the majority of healthcare personnel, yet their needs are not taken into account, neither as healthcare personnel who are more exposed to the risks of the virus, nor as those who need care, and their health needs and healthcare needs are different than those of men, yet men still form the model of the person who needs to be taken care of, and women's health needs get neglected, including this is an acronym for sexual and reproductive health needs, which in some countries get totally neglected, and not only neglected, but as we will soon see, there are some leaders in the world who cynically take advantage of the emergency situation and the pandemic to further curtail women's sexual and reproductive health needs and rights. And abortion clinics have been shut in so many places, not only in Africa, but as you know very well, in North America and in the United States. And laws have been tried to pass to curtail women's advances in this area of sexual and reproductive health needs and rights. So this is the point about the health needs and the health issues of the pandemic. Going on to the economic aspects of the pandemic, this crisis has already been named She-Cession, and this is in contrast to the 2008 global economic crisis, which for some reason was named He-Cession, and in contrast to the 2008 crisis, it is very clear that women's economic disparity is again much higher than that of men. As we see here, while women make up only 39% of global employment, and this is of course the formal employment, they account for much more than 50% of the overall job losses. And women's jobs are almost twice as vulnerable to the crisis, and men's. This is already taken into account the fact that women compose the majority of those who are in the informal sector, migrant workers, home workers, all those who are really not accounted for, all that what is sometimes called the gray market, the informal sector. So they are much more susceptible to lose their jobs and to lose their income. So this is the economic part of the pandemic. Now, the other obvious aspect where women are being impacted much, much harsher than men is that we're no longer talking about double burden. We're now talking about the triple burden and the triple shift that women are under, which has so much increased as a result of the pandemic. It's working from home together with taking care of the children, homeschooling. School systems have been shut down and in some parts of the world have not even been reopened, and who knows whether and how the next school year is going to look like. And it is women who are now taking care of children at home and are responsible for homeschooling wherever there is homeschooling. And of course, women are those who bear the much, much greater share of taking care of the vulnerable and the elderly who are at much, much higher risk in light of the virus. So there is a huge increase in women's share of unpaid care work, and this is really a subject for a whole different lecture and discussion. And of course, I did not even mention violence, but I'll get to that in the next slide. Here, I just want to point to the fact that everything that I'm discussing now is really at the forefront of the United Nations and of all the major international organizations who are very well aware of these disparate impacts, disparate gender impacts on men and women. And we will not have time to listen to Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, who delivered some very, very strong speeches to all the state members of the UN to put women and girls at the center of efforts to recover from COVID-19. And likewise, it's the World Health Organization and, as I said, all other major international organizations. And Guterres and the United Nations and UN Women were very, very quick to point to the heightened vulnerability and susceptibility of women to violence as a result of the pandemic. Now, there are various factors that really increase and exacerbate women's susceptibility and vulnerability to be exposed to gender-based violence as a result of the pandemic. And again, I will only mention a few of them. The stress and the uncertainty intensifies the patterns already existing of violence and control. The lockdown practically simply prevents women from seeking aid and from seeking external help from agencies that in usual times can offer some redress and some protection. Shelters have been shut down. Emergency helplines have been shut down. We at the Rackman Center for the Advancement of Women at Bar-Ilan University are operating a helpline, and we did not shut down. Even during the lockdown, we continued to answer the phones, although our ability to offer help was obviously narrower. But just as an example, the calls to our helpline almost tripled when comparing this 6 months period to last year's 6 months period. And we're monitoring all the calls. More than a third of them have to do with violence-related issues due to COVID-19. And this is really just a tiny example. And we have data and we have really horror stories from all over the world. And just another point to mention, there was a period during the lockdown where courts even did not operate, and that obviously gives a false sense, or not a false sense, it gives a sense of impunity to those who are exposing violent behavior, to battering men, to violent men. They know that there is no enforcement. at the time of the lockdown and the shutdown of all the justice system. And we have to note the greater vulnerability of specific groups of women, such as domestic workers, older workers, women with disabilities, women who have no access to technology or working remotely from home, women who are exposed to intersectional discrimination, and so on and so forth. Moving on, I already mentioned the fact that there is some leadership in the world, male leadership in the world, who cynically take advantage to openly curtail women's rights. And here I put just one example of Poland, whose government has already decided to draw back from a very, very important international instrument to fight gender-based violence against women and domestic violence. And this is the Istanbul Convention. And maybe some of you in North America have not heard of this convention because it is a European Council instrument. But by the way, it is open to all countries in the world. And here in Israel, we are trying already a number of years now. The Rackman Center is really pioneering the attempt to have the government ratify this convention, because as I said, it's open to other countries in the world, not just Council of Europe countries. And it has become the gold standard of what countries, what states, what governments have to do in order to protect women from gender-based violence and from domestic violence. Some see it as a radical instrument. So here you have it. Countries like Poland and absurdly, Turkey is now also threatening to withdraw from the convention. Turkey was the first one to ratify the convention in 2011. And now under the right-wing leadership, and I will not go more deep into politics at this discussion tonight, but we can see this pattern of right-wing leadership, leadership which is very much aligned with strong religious forces, that is opposing, that is in fact joining forces as a backlash to women's advancement and to gender equality. And the Istanbul Convention has become somewhat of a symbol as a progressive country or as moving away from progress, as we see here with Poland. Now, as I already said, all this set the stage to ask about women's leadership. So we've seen that women are more vulnerable, they're being hit harder by the virus, and then we have this incredible reality of women's leaders faring much better than male leadership, than men leaders. And if you just Google the net, you get so many results, media results, but then as you will see, not just media, not just anecdotes, you also see scientific proofs for this sense of women leaders doing much better job than men leaders. Although they comprise only about 8% of political leaders globally, which is really amazing in 2020, women have accounted for an estimated 40% of the most successful responses to COVID-19, and you have some of the pictures of these incredible women leaders. And your reporter from the US, the well-known Nick Kristof, has calculated that women-led countries have a 6 times lower death rate than those led by male counterparts in similar countries. And if the United States had the coronavirus death rate of the average female-led country, more than 100,000 American lives would have been saved. And I think this number is really mind-boggling. And when you go further, and I will not take you now through this scientific research, it's just one of a number of researches, and I picked this because it also has Israel here, comparing countries with similar population size and other circumstances. And you can see, sadly, how Serbia is doing much, much better than Israel, how New Zealand is doing incredibly much, much better than Ireland, and so on and so forth. And just anecdotal pause, my favorite leader in the world, Jacinda Ardern, just one example, because it really gives you the beginning of understanding of some of the reasons for why female leadership is so different than from male leadership. It's the direct approach to the people. It's the participatory leadership style. It's the willingness to admit mistakes, to hear others, to take seriously scientific data and scientific information. And going back to Jacinda Ardern, this is just, I'll just play it for you. 1 minute, hope it works.
Evening, everyone. That I would jump online quickly and just check in with everyone, really, as we all prepare to hunker down for a few weeks. Excuse the casual attire. Can be a messy business putting toddlers to bed, so I'm not in my work clothes.
So this is when she approached her people, explaining them through Facebook what's going to happen in the next few weeks, when she took the very brave decision to lock down, to shut down, and it proved to be lifesaver, literally, for the people of New Zealand. Now, I don't think I ever saw any male leader addressing the citizens with, you know, training and from the basement at home. So it's just a demonstration of traits that women's leadership and women's style of confronting challenges is really different from that of men. And in the next slide, we can see the Prime Minister of Norway holding a press conference for children, and again addressing them at, you know, eye level, as we say, letting them ask questions, and very, very seriously taking 2 hours of her very, very busy schedule and answering the children who wanted to know whether they would still be able to have their birthday at school, and what's going to happen to their friends, and so many other issues that really are of concern to the little ones. Caring about everybody and putting life in front of the economy, which eventually proved to be the very right decision to save the economy and not just to save lives. And all this brings me to the question of what's happened in Israel. What has been happening in Israel? And here on the left side, you can see very clearly the composition of the national agency, which was in charge of handling the coronavirus during the first wave between March and somewhere in end of May or June. No women. All former military and security forces personnel. Next to this national agency, there was an experts consulting commission composed of 23 experts. And experts are scientists, are doctors, are medical doctors, all male. No woman was in either of these agencies. And this has led some of us, civil society organizations, including the Rackman Center, to appeal to the High Court of Justice. And if you've been listening to this webinar series of Hiddush, I'm sure that by now you're very well aware of the role that the High Court of Justice plays in Israel. Some would say that it is not very advisable, but us civil society organizations have no choice and very often have no recourse but to turn to the High Court of Justice. And we appealed the High Court of Justice against this composition of the experts committee. During the hearing, it was claimed by the state that this experts committee no longer functions, and so we had to withdraw the petition, but the court really ended up with some very strong rhetoric about the importance of having women and including women within these national decision-making bodies. And here, as I said before the petition to the High Court of Justice and after the petition to the High Court of Justice, so this is the public commission or public council which advises to yet a new national machinery for protecting Israel against the coronavirus. And here you can see quite a few pictures of women. However, one wonders, what are the powers of this particular council? We tried to find out what really are the powers and what are the responsibilities of this body. It seems that it's rather a symbolic body. And the body that really has the power to take decisions is the Corona Cabinet. And the Corona Cabinet, consisting of government ministers, first consisted of only male ministers. And when asked to explain this by one of the female ministers, Netanyahu replied, "I too sometimes wonder at night why the traffic light is red." So those of you who can read Hebrew can see that this has led to an outburst of critique, and not just by women, and not only through the internet. As you probably know, the country is experiencing a wide range of protests currently, and this particular move by Netanyahu just gave more weapons to the protesters. But it just leaves us with the fact that practically nothing really changed from the first wave to the second wave, which leads me to asking, is there anything particular within Israel that makes it different, that perhaps Israel is an idiosyncratic case, unlike other countries in the global north, where we like to see ourselves belonging to? What makes Israel different from European countries, from North American countries, when it comes to gender relations and to women's rights and to the position of women within society? There are a number of explanations, but first and foremost is what we can term the monopoly of the orthodoxy in Israel, which functions very conveniently, sometimes in an invisible manner. The invisibility of the religious exclusivity of family laws, the invisibility of the Orthodox monopoly, which is perpetuated throughout law and society, and which has ramifications both internally within the religious community, secluded religious community, but also has very vast ramifications externally to the Israeli society at large. So I'll just give a few examples here because we are running out of time. So one of the examples, which can be a bit misleading. At first, it could be seen as something which is internal to the religious community, to the Orthodox, perhaps even ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel. And if you can read quickly, this was a development towards the end of the first wave of the coronavirus in Israel, when the lockdown started to fade away and the school system started to reopen. And within the ultra-Orthodox society, it was decided that only boys' schools would reopen because only boys have to learn Torah, and the girls are, of course, not obligated to learn Torah. And it was on account of a very important move by Hiddush, also together with the involvement of the Rackman Center, appealing to the Attorney General's office, and through the involvement of the Attorney General's office, this was eventually changed. And I said that this is a bit misleading because one could claim that this is a decision which is internal to the ultra-Orthodox society, and under some position, ideology of multiculturalism and pluralism, perhaps even legal pluralism, one should, in fact, let them get away with this. Let them organize themselves internally as they see fit, which is, of course, a wrong position to take. And that is why we joined Hiddush in this initiative to object to this decision by the ultra-Orthodox leadership. And we can discuss that later. I just want to move on to a couple of other examples. And here we are getting to the way that the ultra-Orthodox perception about gender roles, about modesty, about women's position and women's place or lack of place within the public sphere, and their perception of gender segregation, the way that it affects Israeli society at large. And in the last few years, I keep saying that I'm in this area of gender equality and advancement of women for quite a number of years now. I would never have imagined, even 10 years ago, that we would be discussing issues of gender segregation in the public sphere in Israel in 2020, in higher education, in universities, in towns, in municipal events, in any public events. This was really unimaginable, but this is the reality of Israeli society in 2020. And one thing that I want to mention within this realm, and it's a development that has taken place during these past months of the coronavirus, is one phase of the battle over the rabbinate, where on account of the revolution, or some would say evolution, in women's Torah studies, the increased entry of Jewish women into higher Torah learning, and the increasing number of women who can really be termed as Talmidot Chachamim by now, this has led women, even within the Orthodox movement, to seek recognition for their level of knowledge. And we have to recall, we have to remember, to be aware that rabbinic ordination in Israel is not just a title, is not just a symbolic title or a title of honor. It has very, very specific practical consequences, practical results, practical status, formal status in Israel. It can sometimes be taken as equivalent to an academic degree for positions within the civil service. Many positions within the civil service, within government service, are open only to those who have the title of a rabbi. And so these women have been seeking recognition, but tactically they decided to appeal not to have rabbinic ordination, but only to be permitted to take the rabbinic exams. And with the assistance of, again, a number of civil society organizations, including the Rackman Center at Bar-Ilan University, we have appealed once again to the High Court of Justice against the refusal of the state rabbinate not to allow them to take the rabbinic exams. And in responding to the court's interim injunction, very surprisingly and very positively, the Attorney General admitted that the current situation where women are precluded from taking these exams is problematic. He did not say it is discriminatory, but he said it could be seemed as problematic. And he suggested a possibility of parallel exams track for women. And just a few weeks ago, in a hearing at the High Court of Justice, the High Court of Justice accepted this view of the Attorney General and ordered the state to examine this suggestion and to come back to the court with its response. But here you can see the unofficial response of the rabbinate, which already threatened to strike if it is forced to train women in rabbinic laws. And we can say that this is to be continued. Now, another legal battle, which again took place during these past few months, has to do with family law, and it's a bit more intricate to explain, but I'll just mention it in 2 or 3 sentences. A very high visibility marital property case where after more than 20 years, very long marriage of more than 30 years, 20 years living together at family home, which was registered only on the husband's name because he owned it prior to the marriage, but they lived in it together, they had renovated it together, they raised their children there together. And towards the end of the marriage, after marital breakdown, there was an allegation that the wife was not loyal, or infidelity on the part of the wife, and the rabbinical court denied her half of the marital home, denied her the share of her share of half of the marital home. The High Court of Justice approved the decision of the rabbinical court in a 2-to-1 decision, which gave us the understanding that there is a possibility to try once more. And here the Rackman Center had initiated, we approached the woman and her lawyer, and together with her lawyer, we petitioned to the High Court of Justice for a rehearing, which is an unusual procedure, but we were granted the rehearing, and the very unusual panel of 9 justices heard the case just a couple of weeks ago. And again, this is to be continued. We have to wait, we have to be patient, and really hope that the High Court of Justice will amend its former decision. The former decision was a decision by 2 of those justices who are viewed as more conservative, more new appointees to the High Court of Justice, so you can get the sense of the internal politics and changing politics of the High Court of Justice. And we can discuss this a little more after the next 2 slides. So this would have been my last slide, but I just an hour ago received these very encouraging news, and they are very much related to the topic that we discuss here, the influence and the effect of the interlocking and interaction between religion and state in Israel, Jerusalem municipality, with a very nice move, decided to offer to couples who are about to get married and cannot have their wedding ceremonies in the usual wedding halls, but have to seek external sites, decided to offer unique sites in the city, but they limited this very generous offer only to those who are allowed to legally marry in Israel, namely only couples who belong to the same religion, mostly Jewish couples, who are recognized as Jews, who can be registered as Jews, and who can be registered within the formal rabbinical registry to be married, and not to non-Jewish couples, not to interfaith couples, obviously not to same-sex couples who cannot officially marry in Israel. And so the Center for Religious Pluralism this time appealed to the district court in Jerusalem, and just this afternoon, the district court accepted their petition and ordered the Jerusalem municipality to offer its free wedding service to all couples. So I just want to go back to the beginning of my talk and to tie it together with the understanding that we are in this together. And when I say we, I mean really women of the world and all those who identify with feminist causes, with causes for gender equality. And I just wanted to quote here from a position paper of UN Women, recognizing that the COVID-19 is not just a challenge for the health systems, but it is a test for our human spirit. And it's not just rectifying longstanding inequalities, but also towards building a more just and resilient world. And here in Israel, the challenge we are facing is even harder due to the influences and the intricate interaction between religion and state, which unfortunately very often impede on gender equality and on women's rights. So I think I'll stop here and we'll see there are questions and comments, and I look forward to some rich discussion, and I'll stop sharing the screen so we can all see each other.
Thank you, Ruth. And I'm sure that all those who are on this webinar and those who listen to it and watch it, review it, view it later on will agree that a tall order, but you have really met all expectations, being able to provide us with a bird's eye view of a global perspective of COVID-19 and women. And the Israeli scene, both from a political and gender perspective, and the religion and state, which is of particular interest to us in these webinars. Just one minor correction, because indeed, as you said, this is just hot from the oven, news that we have received sort of in a partial form. The court has not made a decision yet. Okay. The instruction or the guidance that indeed the municipality of Jerusalem may not discriminate couples that choose to marry outside the rabbinate in making these public sites available to them for the celebration is not yet a court decision. Hopefully the court will decide, but the Attorney General has decided to appear in the case, which is the prerogative of the Attorney General, and the Attorney General's representative presented that view. Now, clearly, it'll be difficult for the court to turn its back to the view of the Attorney General, but it's not a final decision yet. But it does sharpen one very important issue, that the participants in our webinars have been aware of, namely the political assault emanating both from the ultra-Orthodox parties and some in the Yamina, and before that the Jewish Home, the Zionist Orthodox Party, the assault on law enforcement agencies, whether the Supreme Court or the Attorney General, and challenging the independence of the position of the Attorney General that once appointed should be able to operate within the system in providing the ultimate guidance, short of legal court decisions, as to what the law requires of state agencies to do. So the example that you gave us is yet another proof of how important it is for all of us, lovers of Zion and those committed to the core principles of democracy, to stand by and support and defend the independence of both the judiciary and the legal advisors and the Attorney General among them. So let's go back to the chat and see a number of comments were made. Of course, people very appreciative of your presentation, and some questions. So one question has to do with your first comments, namely, what are those 8 countries that have full equality among the 193 countries of the world?
So I'm talking about legal equality, not equality in practice, because there is a difference between law on the books and the law in practice or law in action. And in terms of enforcement and in terms of the practicality, the actual situation, as we say in Hebrew, bashetach, on the ground, no country has achieved full equality. But those 8 countries, I do not remember all 8 of them, but they would be the Nordic countries. Finland, Norway, Sweden, not sure about Iceland, I think Denmark, and I think Canada, and I'm not sure about New Zealand. I think New Zealand, but I'm not 100% sure. I think it is New Zealand as well. So these would be the eight countries, obviously not the US.
All right, another question, Richard Horowitz. You said that countries led by women are doing better regarding the coronavirus than others, and explained because women are better at admitting mistakes, hearing others, and understanding scientific data. But how do you know these 3 things are true?
So there's a huge body of literature, academic literature and research that looks to the differences within leadership style, gender differences between women and men, and not just political leadership, but also leadership in private companies or in commercial companies. And the data is already there, very convincing. And what we now see during the pandemic is almost like a laboratory test in real time of how these countries with very similar starting points, with very similar conditions in terms of population, in terms of health measurements of population, and the outcomes, the different outcomes between those that are led by women and those that are led by men. And it is connected to these traits that some would argue against them. Some would say that this is a very narrow perception of female versus male. Some would say that this is a very deterministic approach to gender or essentialist approach to gender. But again, the scientific data is there. Women it is connected to the whole feminist approach of Carol Gilligan talking about women's different voice or different morality. Women think in relational terms versus men who think in goal-oriented and rights-oriented approach. And look at Merkel. Compare Merkel to the male leaders around her. See how she approached the challenges, see how she took the decisions in a participatory manner, in a democratic manner, in hearing others, in not thinking that she knows better than everybody, in willing to admit mistakes, and in thinking, in putting in high priority the actual lives of her people more than the economy, which again, as I explained, proved to be the right approach also to be able to save the economy, to reopen the economy much faster. So I know this is a controversial to some people idea, but I am really very convinced about the proofs that we are now witnessing on account of this pandemic.
Thank you. There was some internal exchange between the participants regarding both New Zealand and the US and the date of the elections, etc. But that is not something that you need to weigh in on.
I just want to say, it's not that all female leaders act that way and behave that way. And it's not that only women can have these styles and these approaches. So it's not a deterministic perspective of gender differences. Male leaders can also adopt these different leadership styles and can adopt this manner of participatory decision-making and humbleness and direct approach to people. And female leaders can be just as narcissistic and know-it-all. And I'm thinking, of course, of the Iron lady. I'm not sure about, in Hebrew we call her Eshet HaBarzel, Margaret Thatcher. So obviously she does not fit this description of the current female leadership, which I talked about. So again, things are obviously much more complex and not as simplistic as I presented them, but the overall theory, I think, does hold true.
Thank you. Now, Rabbi Rachel Yurovitz, a member of our Hiddush, Rabbis and Candidates for Religious Freedom and Equality Executive Committee, is asking, how does allegation carry weight without proof? But maybe you can use this opportunity to provide our participants with sort of a very brief understanding of two issues that are connected with it. One is maybe take us back to the Bavli decision and the challenge of division of property when viewed by the civil courts and by the rabbinic courts. And you mentioned the revolt threatened by the chief rabbinate regarding the examination, or Torah examination of women. So maybe a word about Bavli, because we dealt a lot with the Barak legacy in these webinars. And in terms of the current case that you were discussing, maybe just put it in further context as to, why would women fare worse in rabbinic courts than if in the civil courts, in the family courts?
So it's a crash course on family law, Israeli family law in 2 minutes. But I'm happy to talk about the Bavli case. I had the privilege of clerking for Justice Barak when he wrote this decision of the Bavli case, and it was an incredible opportunity just to see how his mind works and how he put this momentous decision into place. And it is the most important decision in family law and one of the most important in religion and state relations in Israel. Basically, the Bavli case 25 years ago held that rabbinical courts are also subject to the civil law when it comes to civil matters such as marital property. So marital property and all the economic consequences of marriage were categorized as civil matters and not as personal status matters. And as civil matters, just like contract, just like property law, like any other question of civil law, Barak then ruled in the Bavli decision that the rabbinical courts have to apply the civil law. They cannot rule according to the religious Jewish law when it comes to these questions and issues of property, of distribution of marital property. And this was in order to achieve some kind of unity within these two parallel tracks, parallel justice systems in Israel family law. The religious courts, which we also have to recall, are not only rabbinic courts, there are also Sharia courts and Druze courts and ecclesiastical courts, right? But now we're talking about the Jewish rabbinical courts. So the two parallel systems, the civil system and the rabbinical court system. The Bavli decision was meant to achieve unity, not to have these different outcomes. However, rabbinical courts could not really accept the Bavli decision. And since then, we have seen back and forth appeals to the High Court of Justice on account of rabbinical courts refusing to apply the Bavli decision and finding ways to countervene and to go around this obligation to apply the civil law. And this is practically what happened in the current case, which has been termed colloquially, I don't like it, but that's how it is being called in the media, the Bogedet case, the woman who betrayed, the
Infidel.
adulteress. Adulteress, yes. So the adulteress case. So what happened here is that it's a bit more complicated than the Bavli decision, because here we had the home, which, as I explained before, was actually registered on the name of the husband. Now, in US, under most American states and English law, and I think most other countries, such a case would really mean that this is a private property of the spouse who owned it prior to the marriage. And it does not get distributed between the two spouses. The other spouse does not get a share because it's really a private property owned prior to the marriage. However, under civil law in Israel, if this case were to be decided by the civil family court, the wife would get half of the family home, because the civil courts in Israel expanded this perception of shared property and did extend it also to private property which was owned prior to the marriage, if it is the family home and if it is long-term marriage with children, just as were the circumstances in this case. Moreover, the civil courts, the High Court of Justice and other civil courts also ruled that morality issues issues of infidelity or adultery or what have you have nothing to do with property issues and should have no effect whatsoever on property rights. So this is the civil law, and it's very, very clear. And going back to the 25 years old Bavli decision, if you really accept what I said about the civil law in this case and what would be the outcome if it were adjudicated in a family court, then the minority justice in the first High Court decision was right, because he said, he decided, he ruled that the rabbinical court ruled against the Bavli decision. The rabbinical court did not abide by the Bavli decision. How come the two other justices approved the rabbinical court decision? They found a way to say that it's not really that it was only based on factual grounds, that the husband never really intended to share the home with the wife. Had he known that she would be unfaithful to him, he would not have intended this sharing intent. Many ways to go around the issue. We thought that this was wrong and that the minority justice was right. And we also saw the danger in upholding the rabbinical decision, because if it is really upheld, then we are about to start an era of adultery trials. Every case would go to the court, preferably on the side of the husbands, to the rabbinical court, and we are all very much aware of the double standard when it comes to issues of fidelity, adultery, and infidelity. Just mention that the concept of adultery under Jewish law is one-sided. It is only when a married woman has relations with a man whom she's not married to that it is called adultery. If a married man has relations with a woman whom he's not married to, it is not adultery. So the double standard is very, very much there. It's very much alive. And if the rabbinical court decision is really upheld and stays as it is, this is a terrible regression to women's rights in Israel. And that's why we appealed to a rehearing, and we are holding our fingers crossed that the rehearing will really result
in a Magen David.
In a Magen David way, yeah, right.
Well, as is so often the case, when you end a program, you come to a point that really should serve as a beginning of a whole new program. So maybe in the future we will do a program where we'll compare the Israeli to the US to the Canadian system when it comes to this clash, because there is the get law in New York, and there are the constitutional issues about the role of religious courts, etc. Well, I hope we'll be able to do it. So I'll just read what the co-chairs of JPLAN, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, wrote. Mark Enshen from Canada writes, same in Ontario,
matrimonial home is divided
regardless of ownership. For family assets, spousals brought into marriage prior to marriage are excluded from assets to be divided on divorce. Assets brought into marriage are excluded from division. And Peter Baxbaum, from the chair of JPLAN, writes, in the New Jersey family law, marital fault is irrelevant to property distribution. Only exception would be where the marital fault wastes the property.
Right.
All right.
Thank
Ruth,
you.
is there anything you want to say as parting words before we end the program?
So I just want to say that it's really a privilege to be able to connect with people who care about what we are going through in Israel, who care about this complex issue of religion and state relations and their influence, their effect on human rights and on women's rights and on gender equality. And we need your partnership. We need to know that you care about this, that you are involved in this, and that hopefully you will be more and more involved and express your views and your commitment to lead Israel on more right and a better track in terms of human rights and in terms of gender equality and women's rights. So once again, thank you for this opportunity, Uri.
Well, thank you. We are, I'm sure, all appreciative of the wealth of information and perspectives and insights that you have shared with us. Actually, when we write to you, to those who registered with the link to the recording, I will also include a link to a video that Hiddush did on the challenge of marriage freedom in Israel. And I'm mentioning that because you'll be able to see Professor Ruth Halperin Kadari there. And just to put it in context, so Ruth is Orthodox. And it's important to understand that, and you will hear much of that in 2 weeks in our next webinar, that Orthodoxy is not as heterogeneous as some from the outside may think. And Ruth is a leader in a growing modern Orthodox community that is combining the principles of tradition with the understanding that they do not contradict the principles of democracy. They do not contradict the ability to grant others the rights and the choice and the freedom that religious individuals can enjoy. So you'll hear Ruth in the video explaining, in addition to others, why it's important for Israel to move in the direction of marriage freedom. So before we part, in 2 weeks, on the 31st, we'll have a program on modern Orthodoxy. The unfolding modern Orthodoxy is a revolution in the making, is a change happening. And we'll have another member of the executive committee of Ruach Hiddush, Rabbi Asher Lopatin, moderating with a wonderful panel of Rabbi Daniel Landis, for many, many years, the head of Pardes, and Daphne Price, the executive director of JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, and Rabbi Avram Malotek, who is the head of a Hillel unique program that he created in New York that is developed all over the world. And recently, headlines identified, acknowledged the fact that he has officiated in a same-sex wedding, clearly showing the really the expansion of parameters of modern Orthodoxy. So join us in 2 weeks. You'll have the invitation coming out soon. Thank you again, Professor Ruth.
Uri, did you want to mention the program we'll be co-sponsoring with the AAJLJ in September? Just in
Go ahead.
We just agreed to co-sponsor a program on a variety of subjects, including the Supreme Court and some of the themes we've been, and it's with the American Association for Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and we'll have further information on that going out to the group. It's a multifaceted program that will be fascinating. So I hope not only in the 31st, but we don't want to give you that big a break. So it'll be early in September sometime. We'd miss you too much if we let it go till October after the high holidays.
So thank you, Peter. Thank you all. Thank you, Ruth. Stay safe, stay healthy, and hopefully we'll see you all and more in the next webinar on the 31st. Shalom from Jerusalem.
Shalom.